Hello and welcome to Privacy, Fundamental Right, Standards, Fundamental Requirement. If you're joining us live, our speakers are in the Slido discussion answering your questions right now. They will also be participating in a live Ask the Expert roundtable on this topic after this session. For audio-video issues, please click the technical support button below. I'd now like to turn it over to Laura Lindsay and John Britton for the presentation.
Thank you, Allie. My name is John Britton. I'm with Google. I'm part of the Standards and Engineering Compliance Group. I've been working on standards for just about 3 years now, and my first real entry into standards was helping develop with Laura this 27701 standard that we're going to talk to you about today. Laura?
Thanks. And I work with Microsoft. I work in the corporate standards group at Microsoft that focuses on cybersecurity and privacy standards. And in particular, we are looking at how we can leverage standards for looking at all of the global regulations around data protection and privacy, which this presentation is based on.
So after this session, we hope that you'll be able to look at within your organization and determine how it's impacted by privacy governance. Identify which privacy governance models impact your organization, choose the right privacy governance model, and then finally, we hope that Laura and I interest you enough in standards that you'll want to participate within your own country to help develop and further international standards. So why an ISO standard? So privacy is a challenging topic, right? Many countries and a lot of people think about privacy and ask the question, is it a fundamental human right? And there's many different questions depending on regions, locations. The world, though, is moving towards looking at privacy as a fundamental right. There's a variety of different existing regulations, from GDPR in Europe to CCPA in California, Australia, Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea. Many different organizations, or excuse me, not organizations, countries have their own look at privacy. And we believe that by looking at ISO and 27701, we can help drive consensus and build a uniform look at how to develop a privacy model.
Great, John. And folks, if you look now at this map, so why do we think that privacy is a global viewpoint? You can see from the global map, countries around the world are initiating some type of privacy or data protection regulation. This regulation can be extensive, as shown in the map by the red countries. Those countries have extremely strong or a large number of regulations. So if you look at Europe, you're going to see GDPR. In China, you've got their data and privacy regulations that they have. The other colors are representing different levels of privacy regulations that are being developed. And you can see that a vast part of the world is already doing some type of regulation. Now, if you're a small company where you are simply working in a single country, it might not seem like a large problem to you that there's 50, 100 different regulations that potentially are out there that you have to meet. But if we think about the fact that we actually work in a global market, and that market means that people are accessing information and accessing maybe products or services from anywhere around the globe, then you could end up having to meet different regulatory requirements. So you are going to potentially be concerned about that. So what we want to do is look at how do we come up with a global solution for this global market. So when we say that, what we want to try to do is imagine the way that we can meet these different requirements. So each jurisdiction, whether that be Hong Kong, Australia, Singapore, South Korea, they all have some different aspect of what they believe the regulation is. And when you look at some of the smaller companies that are trying to do business in these areas, if you have multiple different types of requirements that you need to meet, then it makes it more difficult to be able to spend the money that you have to do to get the audit to show the proof that you're doing this. So we want to come up with something that's a little more global in the solution. ISO and ISO IEC standards are a way to look at doing that. They are international standards. They adhere to the World Trade Organization technical barrier to trade rules, which means that they help people be able to do work in different countries following the same technical requirements. And we want to have something that's going to provide some flexibility so that as you see these different regulations, we can see what is happening and how we can put this together. So when we talk about using ISO and we talk about ISO IEC 27701, we're going to talk about how this can then be used to solve this global problem that we're starting to see with the many different and the number of different regulations that we're starting to see crop up. So why then this particular ISO IEC standard? In other words, why can't we use something that already exists? Or why does it need to be an ISO IEC standard? Or, what does that really mean? Well, one of the unique things about this, and I'm going to say just one item, because a lot of the times people say ISO or they say IEC, and you'll notice here I say ISO IEC. All this really means is that it is a standard that's adopted by both ISO and IEC together. So it's not simply an ISO standard, it's not simply an IEC standard. So just to clarify why we use that terminology. So why 27701? So what we did was you wanted to look at the fact that in theory, most people are familiar with ISO IEC 27001, or the Information Security Management System, ISMS. Now, people look at that, and that's touted as one of the top tier standards and top tier types of certifications that you can get. And you would normally think that that would be sufficient to scope and take into account laws and regulations that are required. Because part of the requirements of an ISMS is to identify what regulations and requirements you need to meet. However, when we actually start looking at these data protection and these privacy regulations, we realize they're a little bit more complex than simply something that information security management would cover. There are things like understanding how the impact to an individual actually impacts what you have to do from a risk management perspective. And so rather than just saying, oh, we're going to create something new, we want to say, how do we provide what a lot of people call sector specific, or in this case, a technology unique situation specific type of requirement that's going to help both the consumers that are worried about data protection and privacy, as well as the regulators who are wanting to do different types of regulations. How can we do that? So we went, this might be a way we can do it. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because, as you saw from the map previously, there are a multitude of ways that people are coming up with new privacy regulations. So rather than trying to have to work in every single one of them, if we take the idea or the concept of a management system and we apply that to privacy, then we can have a flexible way that we can standardize and create certification mechanism that will provide for a way to meet these privacy regulations without having to go and do this 50 times or 100 times in each of the different jurisdictions. So let's talk a little bit about what it is then. So if we say 27701 and we say, okay, well, what is it really? How does it really work? Well, part of how it works is that it takes the concept of you already have some type of information security management system in place. And part of that information security management system requires that you have to do a risk assessment. So it's a risk-based concept. So what we want to do is we want to be able to leverage that and in turn add to it the privacy and data protection regulation requirements that need to be included, that also understand that there's specific items that are going to cover that a data subject or an individual's rights are. And so we take that concept and we just say, okay, we know we want to extend what we have. And then we look at it and we say, unlike information security, where there's usually a security team or you're looking at it from the organization perspective, well, when you start talking about data protection, you have a couple of different roles that you see coming up in a lot of these regulations. And those roles are, is somebody a data processor or are they a data controller? And they have some obligations that they both have to meet. And there's certain obligations that if you're a data processor, you need to meet, and certain ones that if you're a data controller, you need to meet. So how do I know what controls I need to implement if I'm a data processor? Well, 27701 takes that concept and it says, we're going to address how you do that. So first you're risk-based, and now you're going to look at it, what role am I playing? So what controls do I need to pick? And the last piece, which is where it helps with the flexibility and helps us be able to look at how we potentially will use this across multiple jurisdictions or with multiple different regulatory requirements, is providing the evidence that you're actually meeting those controls. In other words, how do I provide evidence to show that I'm in compliance? And so when I've determined what controls I have, I now have guidance of what type of evidence would show that I'm now meeting that control. And that's in the implementation guidance that's also included in 27701. So you get this lovely mapping of taking these individual steps together to be able to produce what is 27701. Now, to give you a better understanding of how we got here, John's going to give us a little bit of history about 27701 and how it came into being. John, over to you. John, I think you wanted to talk on mute because we want to hear about the history of ISO IEC 27701.
I apologize. I was on mute. Thanks, Laura. So ISO 27701 started, it was presented by the French delegation to the ISO community within SC27. That's a subcommittee 27. And at the time, the title of ISO IEC SC27 was just information security. We've only recently added the privacy addition to the name in the past 2 years. It took about 3 years for this from birth to publication. Rather interesting process if you're not involved. So documents presented, new work item proposals made, experts get together, they form a draft. Each international company, or excuse me, not company, country, then gets together with their own experts, makes recommendations, and that goes through voting. And that's why it takes about 2 to 3 years for a typical standard to make it from its inception into publication. As Laura mentioned, 27701 expands on 27001 to more fully integrate privacy, right? So 27001 had mentions of privacy, 27017 expanded on that, 27018 expanded a little more. It was really time, and the French decided that there really needed to be a very specific standard and set of controls on privacy. And 27701 is that PIM solution, so a privacy information management system, right? And the great thing about this ISO standard is that your auditors, if they're doing the 27001 audit, are familiar with how to audit on 27701. Too many sevens, too many zeros, too many ones. But your auditor will allow you to not have to switch gears and go find a different auditor. All of these are ISO. All the auditors that do 27001 can also implement your 27701 audit. So hopefully that's a brief history, and hopefully I've excited you a little bit about standards. Laura?
So now looking at this, so John's talked about how you can certify to it and what it means. So let's talk about how it all comes together. So in looking at this diagram, you can see that we start with 27001. We add the processor and controller guidance that I had mentioned previously, as well as the privacy enhancements to 27001. All of this together is what creates 27701. Now that's all well and good, and now we have a standard. But how do we get to that certification? How do we make sure that a certification can be used, and how do those get created? Well, if you look at the purple box, we say, okay, we now need to understand that to get a 27701 certification, you're going to need to do a lot of what 27001 does for its certification as well. And the way that the ISO system actually puts this all together is it says, we're going to create what they call a scheme. In other words, this is a privacy scheme that they've created based upon 27701. And the way that they provide the consistency for that scheme and how it's audited is they actually create another standard, which they're in the process of doing, that states what the requirements of an auditor is if they're going to create a certification and do a certification audit for 27701. And that particular one, and we know that this is a lot of numbers and it's a number soup, but you'll notice it's ISO IEC 27006 Part 2. And the reason that it's a Part 2 or -2 is because, again, it's building on the fact that 27001 is an established ecosystem of the standard and the implementation guidance and the certification. So 27701 is leveraging that. The Part 2 of this is, what are the requirements that an auditor needs to do to audit for certification 27701 environment? And that is what they're in the process of making. So when that happens, they will get that. You'll be able to have certificates that are done in a consistent way based on an accreditation that would give you a certificate for 27701. Now you may ask, well, why is that important? Well, it's important because we want to be able to use it for multiple regulations. We want to be able to have a regulation or a regulator accept that certification so that you don't have to do it 10 times, 15 times, 20 times. It makes it a little more cost effective. So when we look at that, we say, why then do we care? And what are the benefits to my organization? Well, the benefits to my organization are that PIMS is already going to integrate into your existing ISMS implementation. There's a potential, and this is where we hope to get to, there's the potential that one audit would satisfy multiple privacy regulations. And we're going to talk about why that's the case and how that might happen. It will help establish the privacy best practices that an organization needs to set up and use to provide evidence or do evidence generation. What this means is that if I have a control, I have to show evidence that I've implemented that control correctly. How do I do that? And then the hope is that this will provide that common industry baseline for privacy certifications. So like 27001 is the ISMS baseline for security certifications, we want to see 27701 become that baseline for privacy certification. So again, we get consistency across the globe to help all organizations raise the bar for security, as well as be able to have smaller organizations be able to have it cost effective for them to meet these security requirements. So now that I've talked about why this is beneficial to have this ISO standard, we want to get into how do you actually use 27701? And John is going to talk us through how the standard actually works, how it's put together, and then we'll end with an example of how you might use this in multiple regulations. John, over to you.
Thanks, Laura. So the structure of ISO IEC 27701 is rather straightforward. The first part is the scope. And if you've never read an ISO standard before, the scope basically is the tenets, the guardrails, however you want to define what the document talks about. So as soon as you pick up 27701, I recommend you read the scope and see if that's applicable to your needs with regards to privacy. The second part is the normative references. And think of this as the bibliography of the book, right? It's talking about all of the different standards that are referenced in 27701 or any other standard. And in this example, we've mentioned 27001 a lot. That's in the normative reference, along with 27002 and a couple of others, other ISO documents. And then the terms and definitions. So if ISO has to make a brand new definition or uses a term, we'll define that in this terms and definitions. And in ISO 27701, there's actually 2 brand new terms, and we'll define those there. Section 4 goes into, it's just a general area, talks about the structure of the document. So it's going to reference sections 5, 6, 7, and 8, and how to go through and find the particular areas that you're looking for. Section 5, and Laura did a great job earlier talking about controllers and PIMs and processors and whatnot. The Section 5 will do the mapping for PIM-specific 27001 requirements, and Section 6 will go into the 27002 requirements. And then specifically Section 7 will cover our PII controllers and how to look at and manage those particular controls. And then finally, Section 8 talks about the guidance for PII processors. So that's a real high-level overview of 27701. I'm going to flip it over to Laura, and she's going to give you, oh, wait, this is my slide too. I'm sorry, Laura. So we were talking about earlier all the different regulations. So you got GDPR and PDPC out of Singapore, and the Australia Privacy Protection, and then out of Korea, there's the Personal Information Protection Act. And if you were responsible for managing privacy guidance and controls prior to 27701, you would have to look at all the different mappings and make sure that you have a plan of action to make sure that you can do business and adhere to GDPR in Australia and South Korea and Singapore, and make sure that everything is aligned properly. But with 27701, think of it as, you know, the United Nations and how they translate everything into English, and then from English to all the different languages. Or think of 27701 as a Rosetta Stone, so that you can have a particular mapping and use 27701 to guide you through your privacy standards and controls that are required if you do business in Australia or Europe or Singapore or the United States. So really think of 27701 as that map and that bridge to make your life easy when you're looking at privacy controls and regulations. And now, Laura, this is your slide, so I'll let you talk. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about a way that you can actually use this, and this is a publicly, freely available mapping tool. So John showed on the previous slide, and I'm going to jump back to that slide really quick, is that you have 27701 in the middle, where you've got GDPR in Australia and the Singapore and South Korea. You've got all of these that are mapping to that. And if you didn't have a central way to map, in other words, if you didn't have that Rosetta Stone, as he mentioned, how would you actually go about mapping these to each other? I mean, you can see that just having 4, how many maps you might have. So let's look at how we might go about doing that. So there is a mapping project. It's called the Data Protection Mapping Project. And you can see that there's the URL is at the bottom of the slide, where you can actually go and look at this. And what I've done here is I've simply pulled out one example, and I've pulled it and looked at it from 3 different ways. The first is you're pulling GDPR, and it shows how 27701 is which clauses or which controls you need to follow in 27701 to meet that GDPR requirement. And then also the Hong Kong Personal Data Protection Ordinance, what are the requirements that it has in it, and how do those map to 27701? So when we look at this, you can see that if you look at GDPR and you see that it's Article 5, the principles relating to processing of personal data. And it specifically calls out that for personal data shall be adequate, relevant, and limited to what is necessary in relation to the purpose for which they are processed. In other words, data minimization. And if we look at this and we see that in 27701, that there are 5 clauses here, 4 of which are things that the controller needs to do, and 1 of which is what the processor needs to do. And it spells out what it is each of those needs to do. what is interesting then about this is if I were to do those 5, I would not only meet the GDPR Article 5 1C, but I would also meet the Hong Kong PDPO Principle 1, Principle 2, and number 26. So all of a sudden, when I'm already doing this, I am finding that I can meet multiple regulations just by following 27701. What's nice about this particular tool is that it allows you to do it either by the full regulation, the full standard, 27701, or by particular clauses in each of those. And if you have to meet, let's say you had to meet GDPR and PDPO and the Singapore requirements, you could pull all of those up and map that to 27701, and it will automatically do that in this tool. Now, to give you some idea, the mapping project has already taken into account Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, and South Korea's regulations, to name a few, but it's also taken in ISO IEC 27701. It's taken in, if any of you have heard of the NIST privacy framework that they worked on in the US, that's also mapped in this tool. So it gives you a wide variety. Now, again, the tool is free, so please take into account the fact that this is not something legal, but it gives you an idea of how the mapping can be done. And it does have a disclaimer at the beginning, but that you can look at it and see how it works. It's a way that 27701 can be used to actually leverage. If I get the evidence for each of these controls, I can show evidence for GDPR, PDPO, and many other different regulations that I may have to meet simply by doing one of them rather than having to figure it out for myself. How do I map each of these individually? So this gives you one practical example of how that happens. And hopefully with that, you've actually learned a little bit more about it. Hopefully you'll have a chance to go and look at it. And we're going to end up with, hopefully you can find a way to apply what you've learned today. John, do you want to summarize this for them?
Thanks, Laura. So next week, and I know it's Friday morning as we're listening to this in Singapore, so take the rest of the day off. Actually, continue to go to the rest of the RSA conference for today and then have a great weekend. But Monday morning, start looking at and determining which privacy governance models are impacted by your organization, right? So look at where you're doing business. Look where your customers are located and try and identify those different privacy governances that are going to be that will impact your organization. And then within the first 3 months, identify and choose the privacy governance models that work for you. If all of your customers are in Australia and you don't plan on doing business outside of Australia, maybe it's fine just to use the Australian privacy plan. But maybe you have plans to grow outside of Australia or Asia Pacific and conquer the world. So look at the right privacy model and the governance model that works for you. And then if you really are interested in learning how the sausage is made and how we all work together internationally to develop international standards, I encourage you to go look at your country's standards body and participate, volunteer, get engaged, and be part of this international community that goes and tries to make the world just a little bit better. And then a final message from me, stay safe, and I'll pass it over to Laura for her final comment.
Thank you. Well, hopefully you've all learned something from this today, and you'll know a little bit more about what 27701 can do for you. I do want to mention, it was mentioned at the beginning, but John and I will be staying for a roundtable afterwards, so you can ask additional questions. If you didn't get a question asked during the session, please join us, and thank you very much for listening. Everybody have a wonderful day and a safe weekend.